Instead, he acts under the assumption that the governments of the UK and Australia are run by a bunch of cucked morons, and that he's going to be able to guilt them into bailing out his company despite the fact that it doesn't pay taxes to these countries. I don't think so, Richard Branson, and let this be a lesson to any multinational corporations considering other types of tax evasion schemes. If you want the sort of benefits that a nation state can provide you, then you need to pay taxes to your nation state. Hello everyone. Richard Branson 14 years ago moved his company Virgin Airlines out of the United Kingdom to avoid having to pay UK taxes. Now he's begging the government of the UK to give him a bailout. Second of all, I'm going to give some brief thoughts on President Trump's executive order suspending all immigration into the United States. Thirdly, the more we learn about the Paycheck Protection Program, the more it appears to be nothing but an unmitigated disaster. Finally, I'm going to talk about how the recent Supreme Court decision in the Ramos case is a win for social justice warriors and a loss for federalism. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Richard Branson is a billionaire. He's the founder of the Virgin Group, a collection of different companies, the most well-known of which are the various Virgin Airlines, as well as Virgin Records. Richard Branson is a committed globalist. He opposed Brexit and he supported the political campaign of Hillary Clinton during the last presidential election. Despite founding his companies in the United Kingdom and him being a United Kingdom resident, Richard Branson decided around 14 years ago that he no longer should be obligated to pay any taxes to the United Kingdom. So he reincorporated all of his businesses in other countries, like places like Bermuda. Despite being a billionaire operating profitable companies, he was then thus able to avoid paying taxes. You see, failing to pay taxes is something that Richard Branson has become quite adept at. In the 1970s, he served prison time for tax evasion. Of course, in our contemporary globalist times, it's almost inconceivable that one of these billionaires would ever serve time in prison for blatant tax evasion. Of course, now that the coronavirus has hit, suddenly people don't want to travel anymore. Business for Virgin Airlines is way down. In fact, it's way down for every airline company. As Virgin is about to reach complete economic failure, total bankruptcy, Richard Branson is now begging the governments of the United Kingdom and Australia to give him bailout loans. This is despite the fact that for over a decade at this point, Virgin Group has not paid UK or Australian taxes. The company is not even wholly owned by Richard Branson. The other larger stakeholders include Abu Dhabi, Singapore, and a minority share is held by China. Why on earth should either the governments of the UK or Australia give a bailout loan to Virgin Atlantic or Virgin Australia? You see, Richard Branson, you chose to be the citizen of the world, not the citizen of a country. You didn't want to be bothered with the types of obligations between a citizen and a nation. And therefore, these nations that you're trying to solicit loans from, they don't owe you shit. If you want a bailout, you should be going to the government of Bermuda or whatever other third world banana republic you incorporated your companies in. And it's not just Richard Branson who finds himself in this position. There are a lot of companies in the exact same position. For example, a lot of the cruise ship industries, which are companies that were originally headquartered in the United States or Europe, reincorporated in these same third world banana republics. And now that the business has dried up because, let's be honest, only an insane person would go on a cruise right now, now those companies have no money and they have no right to seek a bailout. They're not US companies, they're not European companies. They're companies of Bermuda or the Cayman Islands. These companies dug their own graves, now it's time to let them lie in it. Absolutely no bailouts to any of these companies. Nope, not now, not ever. If Richard Branson is as concerned as he says he is about all the employees of his Virgin company, then why doesn't he give a loan to the business himself? Richard Branson has a net worth over $4 billion. He could easily afford to loan his own company $1 billion of his dollars. I'm not even talking about charity here. Richard Branson could loan his own company the money with the obligation that he be paid back when all of this has been turned around. Instead, he acts under the assumption that the governments of the UK and Australia are run by a bunch of cucked morons, and that he's going to be able to guilt them into bailing out his company despite the fact that it doesn't pay taxes to these countries. I don't think so, Richard Branson, and let this be a lesson to any multinational corporations considering other types of tax evasion schemes. If you want the sort of benefits that a nation state can provide you, then you need to pay taxes to your nation state. The second thing I want to talk about, which I'm just going to talk about briefly, is President Donald Trump's recent announcement that he is issuing an executive order temporarily banning all immigration into the United States for the purpose of protecting workers. Now, I'm obviously very much in favor of this. And if you want to know why, you can watch my video yesterday, the first 10 minutes of it. I give a pretty good overview of why US immigration policy has been very misguided. I just have a couple thoughts on this. First of all, this is a great accomplishment by President Trump. There are really three things that our country desperately needs to solve the issues posed by illegal immigration and drug smuggling across the US-Mexican border. The first of those things is an end to legal immigration. The second of those things is a US-Mexican border wall. And the final thing would be to shut down the ports of entry between United States and Mexico. Right now, we have legal immigration at least temporarily suspended. We have the US-Mexican border wall being built, and we have reduced traffic through the ports of entry. Now, obviously, if we really want to seriously crack down on drugs entering the United States, we should close the ports of entry entirely. However, as I said in one of my videos last week, this has had an effect. Street drug prices in the United States have tripled since new restrictions were put on these ports of entry. The tripling of drug prices are going to make them unaffordable to some drug addicts, which is a great thing. Maybe those people can finally get sober and rejoin society. So from an immigration/law enforcement perspective, Donald Trump's administration has scored some real victories. Even though Donald Trump's presidency has not been nearly as transformative as I would have liked, even though Donald Trump has mostly continued rather than abolished the neoliberal policies of past presidential administrations, he still at least has delivered on some of his promises when it comes to immigration. I would also say this is a major win for the Groyper movement, which sought to get conservatives to abandon their support for legal immigration. Now, one caveat is this executive order is just temporary. It suspends illegal immigration during the coronavirus. However, the executive order makes clear that the purpose of it is to help protect workers. We're not putting a moratorium on immigration because we're afraid that immigrants are going to spread the virus. We're putting a moratorium on immigration because of the economic effects that the coronavirus is going to have, which will make it more difficult for people to find employment. Now, here's my recommendation on how Donald Trump could modify this executive. Now, here's how President Trump could go about making this into a permanent immigration ban. What President Trump should order that before any immigration can be resumed into the United States, a majority of workers, somewhere in the lines of 70 to 80%, need to have emergency funds. 70 to 80% of American workers will need to have enough money in their bank accounts that they could pay all of their bills for 4 months even if they have no income coming in. This would be based, of course, on a common sense, basic fundamental tenet of personal finance. Before encumbering yourself with any potential financial obligation, because by bringing in immigrants, the United States is encumbering itself. It's responsible for these people in the event that something happens. Before that takes place, there needs to be an emergency fund put into place. Now, anyone who would oppose a requirement like that would be someone who is acting unreasonably and recklessly. I mean, remember, this is the most basic tenet of individual financial responsibility. Of course, if the United States economy after coronavirus is going to in any way resemble its previous self, we will never come even close to 70 to 80% of US workers having emergency funds. So if President Trump conditions the resumption of immigration in this way, it'll either mean that immigration is permanently restricted to the United States, or that our US companies will have to dramatically alter the way that they do business in a way that benefits American workers heavily. If President Donald Trump is serious about America first, that's what he should do. Moving on to the third thing that I wanted to talk about, the Paycheck Protection Program is completely out of money. And recently we've been learning more and more about what companies were approved for loans. Moving on, the more that we learn about the Paycheck Protection Program, the U.S. program that was supposed to help American small businesses, the more it appears to be an absolute unmitigated disaster. Now, last week, the Paycheck Protection Program ran out of money. I highlighted in a video on this channel my own experience with the Paycheck Protection Program and how Bank of America used the program in a weaselly way to enrich itself. But it now appears that Bank of America was hardly the only bad actor when it comes to this program. It now appears many of the quote-unquote small businesses that are going to be receiving funds from the Paycheck Protection Program turn out to be large publicly traded U.S. companies. For example, Potbelly Sandwiches has received a $30 million loan under the Paycheck Protection Program. Now, in what alternate reality is Potbelly Sandwich a global chain sandwich shop that has sandwich stores across the United States as well as in other foreign countries? In what world is that a small business? Potbelly Sandwiches is a company with $332 million in assets and $409 million in annual revenue. Why are they getting $30 million through the Paycheck Protection Program? How is it that they won the Paycheck Protection Program lottery while thousands of actual small businesses in U.S. churches are left with nothing? Potbelly Sandwiches should absolutely not be getting any money through this program. First of all, for all of these small businesses worth saving, Potbelly's got to be at the bottom of the list. The company is basically a shitty knockoff of Quiznos, but its sandwiches aren't even as good. If someone were to ask me a recommendation for a sandwich shop, I would generally tell them to avoid the chains and try local. But if for some reason I had to recommend a chain, Potbelly would be at pretty much the bottom of the list. In addition to that, as a publicly traded company, Potbelly Sandwiches is in a privileged position to access finance options that wouldn't be available to regular small businesses. They could do a stock offering, for example. That's something that most small businesses would be unable to do. Most small businesses are in a position where the only way they're going to get any financial assistance is through this Paycheck Protection Program. So no publicly traded companies should be participating in it, period. This should be a PR disaster for these companies. If you're an American whose church applied for funding through the Paycheck Protection Program, only to be told by these weasel banks like Bank of America and Wells Fargo that before the loan could be processed, that they ran out of money, then why on earth would you ever eat at a place like Potbelly Sandwiches again? Given the fact that Potbelly Sandwiches is a $1 million company, I'm sure that puts them in a privileged position with these banks to make sure that their paycheck protection application made it to the front of the line. Shake Shack also received a $10 million loan through the Paycheck Protection Program. Shake Shack is also a publicly traded company that's also a global chain restaurant. However, due to outrage, Shake Shack has decided to return the $10 million in Paycheck Protection Program loans. Potbelly Sandwich and all of these other publicly traded companies who receive money under this program should do the same thing. Also in the news, the first lawsuits over the Paycheck Protection Program have been filed. The first bank being sued over this is Wells Fargo. So far, I haven't heard anything about a Bank of America lawsuit, but you better believe that it's coming. I won't forget what you did, Bank of America. What a corrupt mess this whole thing has been. When all of the mega corporations and banks got their bailout through the $4.5 trillion in Federal Reserve loans, they didn't have to go through arbitrage through the Small Business Administration. They didn't have to put up with all this bullshit. They just got the loans. Why can't it be like that for regular Americans and regular small businesses? Why do we have to put up with this nonsense? Finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about is the recent Supreme Court decision in Ramos versus Louisiana. This decision overturned Supreme Court precedent directly on issue and indicates that the U.S. Constitution requires in any felony jury trial for the verdict to be unanimous. Now, previous Supreme Court precedent upheld verdicts that were nearly unanimous. Despite this, the majority of states in the United States require unanimous verdicts in felony trials. Only 2 states do not. The state of Oregon allows for there to be 1 dissenting juror, while the state of Louisiana allows there to be up to 2. The other 11 or 10 jurors still have to be unanimous in these states. Now all states will be exactly the same in regards to jury trials. This is principally why I oppose this judicial precedent and why I hate the Supreme Court of the United States. Ever since the 1960s, the Supreme Court has established itself as the most insidious anti-democratic political institution in our country. The Supreme Court has done more than any other political institution at globalizing and homogenizing U.S. society. Under the pretense of individual rights, the Supreme Court has seen to it that every single state and locality in the United States has to be completely the same. Louisiana has to be the same as New York, has to be the same as Phoenix, has to be the same as Los Angeles, etc., etc. It is these same Supreme Court precedents that have absolutely eviscerated local cultures and customs in different localities throughout the country. When you go to American cities whose culture predates the 1960s, you will see that they have a lot of unique character to them. The way New Orleans looks is very different than, for example, Charleston, South Carolina, or New York City. However, if you look at any of the suburbs, any of the cities that were largely built after the 1960s, everything looks exactly the same. Ugly and utilitarian. This is not what the founding fathers intended for our country. They believed in federalism. They believed in state rights. They believed that states should ultimately govern themselves, that they shouldn't have dictates put onto them by some unelected body of Supreme Court justices. Judicial review is not mentioned in the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights were only originally supposed to apply to the federal government, not the states. Now more than ever, we need more regional diversity. We need more federalism. We need more localism. We need less homogenization. Requiring every problem in this country to be solved by the massive federal government is a bad idea. Local governments are much more responsive to and much better at solving what are ultimately local problems. The U.S. Supreme Court, meanwhile, is completely detached from these localities that it regulates. It's entirely politically unaccountable. These Supreme Court justices serve basically lifetime terms. The Supreme Court justices don't care about following legal precedents and pursue their own personal agendas. For example, there was already a Supreme Court precedent that said that non-unanimous jury verdicts were acceptable under the Constitution. Worst of all, though, these Supreme Court justices are entirely detached from ordinary Americans. These are all people who went to elite colleges, elite law schools, and they clerked for prestigious court of appeal or previous Supreme Court justices. They are neoliberal elites drawn from the managerial class of this country. They have no business telling small towns in places like Louisiana or Wyoming how they need to run their affairs. What we desperately need politically in this country is more capacity to solve problems on a locality-based level and less tinkering by managerial elites who live in distant lands. The absolute frustration with the constant tinkering by a distant, unaccountable, aristocratic class is what led America to become an independent country in the first place. It's what led the founding fathers to embrace the concept of federalism, where states had primacy and the federal government was limited to only an auxiliary role. So yeah, the Ramos decision is not a victory for civil rights. It's a setback to federalism. And it's also a boon to social justice warriors. For years now, social justice warriors have encouraged people to be dishonest during the jury selection process to try and get on juries, and then through jury nullification to acquit the defendant even if there's been adequate evidence that they are guilty. It's notable that one of the two states who had this law that allowed for non-unanimous juries was Oregon. I'd be hard-pressed to come up with a state with a higher per capita number of SJWs than the state of Oregon. Whereas before this Supreme Court precedent, if one of these guys made it onto the jury could still deliver justice. You just get one of these SJWs on the jury panel, and the trial is shot. Whatever taxpayer resources went into it, because some of these jury trials last for months and involve public expenditures well over hundreds of thousands of dollars. Well, all of that money is just wasted at this point. So anyways, that's all that I have to talk about today. If you enjoyed this video and you're not already subscribed to my YouTube channel, please subscribe.